We have growing problems of pollution in many parts of the world. Pollution of the air, pollution of water, pollution of the land, pollution of the sea. We have the climate change problem. Many of us think that's one of the very biggest challenges facing the world at the moment as the temperature rises, as it's projected to rise 2-3 degrees over the next century. Very drastic changes could come about in the world. And then we have equally severe the social problems in many parts of the world, the persistence of poverty, of unemployment, lack of opportunity in life, and the unfair distribution of resources. And of course all of these problems above then feed into and exacerbate the problems of tensions, political tensions between different parts of the world, the growth of terrorism, the clash of civilizations. All those are big issues for the world ahead. And sustainable development is the challenge of can we manage to plot a future path of the world that avoids or contains some of those serious and worrying threats. So, what is the dialogue of sustainable development all about? Now, I'm not going to expound all these great reports. I expect some of them are familiar to some of you. They may form the background to some of the work you're going to be doing in the next 2 weeks and in your longer-term studies. But those of us who've been involved in international activity on sustainable development over the last 20 years, these are some of our key staging posts at the world level. The Brundtland report, Mrs. Brundtland, then Prime Minister of Norway, who produced the first comprehensive analysis with a number of colleagues from around the world for the United Nations, Our Common Future, in 1987. A document that is still a tremendous analysis of the problem and what might be done about it. And led fairly soon in United Nations terms, 5 years later, to the Rio Summit, the Earth Summit in 1992, which produced the first effort to tackle climate change on a global scale, the Climate Change Convention, the first effort to tackle the loss of biodiversity on a global scale, the Biodiversity Convention, and this great document, Agenda 21, 200 pages long, which is an analysis of all the issues and their interactions and the kind of things that the world needs to do to solve the problems I've just referred to. What progress has been made since then? Well, 10 years on, 2002, we had a reprise of all that activity at the Johannesburg World Summit on Sustainable Development. And I think one has to say that the 10 years has seen some progress in some areas, but not all that much worldwide. And the Johannesburg Summit was, I think it's fair to say, a rather more depressed occasion than the Rio one had been. At Rio, there had been a real sense that we were setting out an agenda that could transform the world and build us a more hopeful future. At Johannesburg, we were feeling in 2002 that the problem is quite daunting and we're not making as much progress as we ought to so far. However, that's not an excuse for giving up on it. It's just a reason for redoubling our efforts at all levels of action. What is clear from all those analyses is that there needs to be action at all levels. There needs to be global action, of course, at the United Nations level, and some understanding between the different parts of the world about what needs doing. There needs increasingly to be action at regional level in the whole of Europe, in the whole of North America, Latin America, at the Asian region in Africa. And then there needs to be nations deciding for themselves what needs to be done in their countries to make the sustainable development objectives achievable. And I'm going to take some examples during this talk from what has been done in Europe, to the development of the European Sustainable Development Strategy, which was adopted last month by the European Council and the European Parliament, and some examples from my own country with the UK Sustainable Development Strategy. Now, I'm going to analyze this, or discuss it, under four main heads of the kind of things that need to be done. I'm going to talk about principles or goals. You have to have a clear idea of where you're aiming at. That's the first key element. Then I'm going to talk about some of the tools of analysis. You have to have a clear way of understanding what the problems are, measuring what's going on. Then I'm going to talk a bit about the measures that need to be taken by the different actors, and then I'm going to talk about the actors themselves and the different parts they can play. So first, the goals, the principles that should underlie our action. And I've calls to be circulated. Have you received, if you haven't received yet, you will receive soon, some of the key documents here, the Rio principles, which set out the 27-28 principles that were agreed in 1992, should underline all action to do with the environment and sustainable development. And then a rather crisper set that were produced by the European Union to underlie their sustainable development strategy. And then I'm now going to just show you in a moment some UK principles which are set out more simply still. The goals themselves, this is the definition of sustainable development that Mrs. Brundtland produced in her famous report on our common future, development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And that definition, which people have criticized and elaborated over time, but has stood pretty well for 20 years now as encapsulating what we are all about in this area. We want development, of course, because there are so many things in the world that still need more resources, more well-being for many people who are without enough to live on at the moment. It's got to meet the needs of the present day, but we've got to have development, and increasingly this is important, that doesn't compromise the ability of future generations to meet their own needs, that doesn't mess up the world for the future. An even more snappy development that has been used by some people of sustainable development is not cheating on our children. And to some extent we're all aware at the moment that this generation is cheating on its children because we're using up too much and we are in danger of doing what one really ought not to do to one's children and grandchildren, passing them on to them a world that is less good, less easy to live in than our present world. So not cheating on our children is a very good definition of what sustainable development should be all about. Here's an expression of it in the UK Sustainable Development Strategy. The first sentence is very like the Brundtland definition: satisfying basic needs, enjoying a better quality of life, a steadily better quality of life, without compromising the quality of life of future generations. But then it goes on to an expression of what are usually referred to as the 3 pillars of sustainable development. That we want a productive economy, of course, which is the engine which drives all development in all countries, delivers high levels of employment and growing prosperity. We want a just society, whatever that means, but one that promotes social inclusion, sustainable communities and personal well-being. We don't want people to be left out, to be driven down to the bottom of the pile, to be excluded from the benefits of society. And the third arm, we want development that protects and enhances the physical and natural environment, and therefore which uses resources and energy as efficiently as possible. So that's the way it's expressed in our UK strategy, and you'll find similar expressions, of course, in the strategies of many other countries in the world. And then this is elaborated a bit further in a statement of principles in the UK strategy, which is quite interesting, I think, in some ways, in that it's put at the top the 2 fundamental objectives that we have. The one on the right, ensuring a strong, healthy and just society, meeting needs of everybody in now and future communities, promoting personal well-being, social cohesion and inclusion, and creating equal opportunity for all. That's the social objective, and it has to be done with the thing at the top at the left, living within environmental limits. That's the constraint. We've only got one planet. We have to live within it in a way that conserves it for the future generations. We must respect the limits of the planet's environment, the limits of its resources and biodiversity, so that we can improve our environment and ensure that the natural resources needed for life are unimpaired and remain in good condition for future generations. And then three underlying principles which are in support of those two aims. Achieving a sustainable economy, that's deliberately put beneath in the UK strategy. Achieving a good economy, growth, all those things aren't ends in themselves. They are the means by which we secure the just society and look after the environment. And sometimes we are led astray by the talk of politicians and others that growth, prosperous economy are the only thing that we really care about. If one thinks more seriously inside oneself, the economy can only be the means to an end. It's a very important means. Of course we need prosperity, a sustainable economy, growth, but we need them in order to achieve the just society and the protection of the environment. And in order to do that, one of the things we have to try and secure in our economy, which we don't always do at the moment, is that environmental and social costs are properly measured and that they fall on those who impose them. The polluter pays principle, and that an efficient use of resources is built into the economy in some ways, in which a complete laissez-faire economy fails to do. So there's quite a lot packed into that idea of achieving the sustainable economy. Now then, the next part that is very important to achieving anything in the world of governance, is to have good governance. And of course we're all aware that there are many parts of the world that have very far from good governance at the moment. And to have good governance, we need to have participation, we need people to be involved so that they feel that they're part of what government is about rather than having it imposed on them. And we need governance that actually engages people, that encourages them, that brings them out into playing their part in creating the world of the future that we want, not one that just subdues people. And then the third key element of making towards sustainable development is knowledge. We need good science. We need to ensure that whatever we do, our policy, our actions, are based on good evidence, on scientific evidence, and we need that evidence to be used in ways that are creative, that aren't merely trying to prevent us doing things, but that are encouraging us to take the right risks and to avoid the wrong risks. So we need a science that is cautious about introducing new things that may damage the world, but is also technologically innovative. So a lot packed within that slide, and we try hard in the UK to make sure that all those principles are observed in following through the strategy. So that's the first key element, and the question is, are those principles, are those goals capable of dealing with the major issues that we wrote down at the beginning? I think one would say that the framework of goals we've described looks more adequate for dealing with some of these problems than with others. The principles are clearly a lot to do with the environmental pressures, the loss of species, with water, with pollution, with climate change. The social principles, I think, probably need some more elaboration if they're to deal adequately with poverty, unemployment, unfair distribution of resources. Nobody has said very much in any of the sustainable development strategies at the moment about the underlying problem of population growth, because it's so sensitive and difficult. We may need to come back to that. And this kind of sustainable development analysis doesn't have very much to say about the political problems of our times, about security, clash of civilizations, terrorism, except in the important but rather bland way that if we had a world that was more sustainable, then probably it would be more secure as well. Some of the conflicts that are arising in the world today are clearly due to growing tensions over shortage of resources. Shortage of oil is beginning to give rise to the conflicts in various parts of the world, and we can certainly anticipate that if some of the environmental problems and shortages become more severe, if oil, if water, if any other key resources become really in short supply, if food starts becoming in competition with the growth of food for fuel, then we shall have more acute problems and security challenges ahead. So sustainable development certainly has a very important part to play in trying to create a world which would be capable of being more at peace, but of course there are many other things that make people conflict as well as the environmental problems. So it's got a part to play, but perhaps not the sole part. Now then, second leg of my talk, tools of analysis. And I expect you'll be spending some time more on this during the 2 weeks ahead. There are a lot of tools of analysis, of course, that are relevant to environmental and sustainable development analysis. I'm going to talk a little bit about indicators, how we measure what is happening in the world, the state of the world, how we measure what the pressures are, how we measure the impact of any of the things we try to do about it. And that leads on to a bit of talk about the more sophisticated forms of environmental impact analysis, or even more sophisticated and difficult to do adequately, sustainability impact analysis. It's quite useful, I here borrow something from the European Environment Agency, to have some sort of conceptual framework in one's mind of how things happen in the world and what we can do about them. This DPSIR framework, driving forces, pressures, state of the environment, impacts on the environment, and responses, policy responses or other responses that people may make to the changes in the world, can be conceived as a sort of closed-loop cycle. If you start at the bottom, you want to measure the environment, the state of the environment, what land use is at the moment, what is happening to our water, what the state of our atmosphere is at the moment, what the state of our seas are. And then on the left-hand side, you want to look at what are the driving forces and pressures that are leading to changes in that state of the environment. And some of the driving forces seem almost inexorable, like the growth of population, economic development, and they all bring great pressures to bear on the state of the environment. And then on the right-hand side, you want to analyze what those pressures therefore do in terms of impacts on the state of the environment. How is the environment changing in response to the pressures that are being brought to bear on it? And then the key element, the responses, that this isn't all an inexorable cycle that you can do nothing about. We can make responses of various kinds. We can just let it all happen, or we can try and intervene through our governments, intervene through our personal action, intervene through what businesses do in response. And those responses can then feed round the loop, modify the driving forces, modify the pressures, possibly even lead to improvements rather than damage to the state of the environment. So our analysis has to be capable of understanding the whole of that loop and what happens in it. The European Environment Agency has gone on, therefore, to develop a typology of indicators, of measures for understanding what is happening in that way, which I think is quite a useful way of understanding the world and the types of analysis that we can apply to it. And we've identified in the EEA 4 main types of indicator. Descriptive indicators, which analyze the state of the environment and what is happening to individual aspects of it. Type B indicators, which are performance, that is, how are our actions measuring up against the goals we have set ourselves. Type C is a rather important one, pollution, eco-efficiency, and that typically will be trying to measure whether we are getting economic growth but getting it without damaging the environment in some important aspects. And then type D, which is a very sophisticated sort of indicator, which is trying to measure the sum total of all the things we're looking at, and are we getting towards sustainable development or not. Let me give you some examples. This is showing glaciers mostly in retreat. This is since 1945 to the year 2000, the loss of the average change in the length of the glaciers in meters, and it's showing the change per year. So the lowest one at the bottom, which has gone down quite a lot, has gone down by about 30 meters a year, and that is one in France. But it's not absolutely uniform, and this is important that we note that not everything is getting worse everywhere. So even within this period, which has mostly seen the retreat of glaciers as ice melts, and there are two glaciers, both in Norway, which, rather against the trend, are increasing in length. And that is one of the interesting features about climate change, of course, that it won't have uniform results in all parts of the world. It may generally be warming up, but some parts may get colder as weather conditions move. And one of the great threats that those of us in Europe, and particularly in Britain, are worried about is that a climate change which will warm up most of the world may disturb the flow of the Gulf Stream across the Atlantic and result in Britain and northern parts of Europe actually getting colder while everywhere else bakes. Would be just our luck. One of those things that we're not certain of yet, but is beginning to be a serious worry. Right, I can do this one now. Good. Yes, this is another type EEA indicator showing changes in the North Sea, and it's showing how warm water species, that's the green area at the top, have been becoming over the last 40-50 years more prevalent in the North Sea, and how cold water species, the blue ones at the bottom, have been shrinking in abundance. And that's just an illustration of how the North Sea is becoming significantly warmer during this period. Now I'm going to go on to some type B indicators to illustrate our performance against targets of various kinds. One of our targets is to reduce the amount of packaging waste and to encourage more recycling or reuse of packaging materials. And we're all familiar with these vast quantities of waste that we produce nowadays. And here are some figures showing the relative performance of different countries in Europe, the 15 original European countries at the top and the 10 new ones, including Slovenia down at the bottom, showing the proportion of packaging waste that was recycled in 2002, 2001, and the target figures that Europe has set itself to achieve by 2008. We've set ourselves the target of recycling 55% of all packaging waste by 2008, and you can see that several countries have got a long way to go. There are some, mostly the Nordic countries and Germany, that are already achieving high levels of recycling, but most of us are still way below the 55% target level. So this is a type of indicator that shows you how you're getting on against a target and is quite good for incentivizing more efforts at national level. And within Europe, we devote some time to trying to produce diagrams of this kind, which are a sort of league table and provide some incentive to each of the countries that are near the bottom to get a move on and try to move out of that relegation position at the bottom of the league and to do better. Type C indicators. Now, these are ones that are illustrating how economic growth may be relevant or related to some other indicator that we are concerned about. So in the transport field, we're all concerned about the apparently remorseless growth in the volumes of transport, the movement of goods and lorries and aircraft all over Europe, all over the world, and the amount of pollution and CO2 that derives from that growth in transport. And the ideal is to manage to find a way of having economic growth without such an enormous growth in movement of goods and the pollution that flows from it. But what this illustrates is that the relationship between economic growth, gross domestic product, and the growth of transport has been very steady over the last 10 years, and it would be the same if you projected this back further into the past, and it is very difficult, therefore, to decouple economic growth from the growth of transport volumes. And finally, a type D indicator. Well, this is looking at gross domestic product, which is a very favourite measure used by politicians around the world to express how well their country is doing. We're having more growth. We're having more growth than our neighbours. We're having more growth than we did under the previous government. It's a great virility system for virility measure for politicians around the world. And yet, as Robert Kennedy said very memorably 40 years ago, GDP measures neither our wit nor our courage, neither our wisdom nor our learning, neither our compassion nor our devotion to our country. In short, it measures everything except that which makes life worthwhile. Rather a good rhetorical statement by Robert Kennedy, but it has underlain the effort over many years to try and find a measure which better expresses, are we really getting better off? Is our sense of well-being better in the world? Is there some better measure of achievement, a single measure of achievement of society than GDP? And people have developed various other measures. One that I quite favour is called the ISEW, the Indicator of Sustainable Economic Welfare, and that tries to take account not only of economics that are captured in the GDP, but also of such measures as how the environment is doing, how well the environment is being protected, and how happy people in society feel with their situation. And that measure, which is a controversial measure, but has progressed much less, of course, than GDP over the last 50 years. Over the last 50 years, GDP for the UK, and it will be the same for most Western countries, has gone up about threefold, from 100 to 300% in a 1950 index. But the measure of ISEW has lagged much further behind and even went down to some extent in our country in the 1970s and early 1980s. And similar graphs have been produced for most other European countries and some in North America. And what does that express? Well, it expresses the sense that many people have that growth isn't what it's all about, and that some of the things that we care about are no better now than they were in the past, that we're actually worried about our deteriorating environment and aspects of our city life that don't seem as good as they ought to do. So quite important to go on working at those alternative measures of what the overall objectives of society are. So I come back to my question, how good are those indicators then for measuring what we really care about? And once again, I think I would say that our indicator sets are quite good at measuring what's happening to the environment and how good we are with our various measures in protecting the environment and biodiversity. They're getting better at measuring conservation of resources. We have good measures now of what's happening to CO2 and other greenhouse gases. We don't yet have a very complete set of measures for dealing with that problem, so we don't have a very good set of indicators either. We have less good measures of eliminating poverty and fairer distribution of resources, partly because there is less agreement in the world about what a fairer distribution of resources would mean or what eliminating poverty would mean. But we do have in the Millennium Development Goals that the United Nations established in 2000 and measures of progress against those, some means of keeping an eye on those issues. We don't have any very good measures of conflict resolution or the state of tension between nations. And going back to the beginning, we have quite good measures that the United Nations and others bring out from time to time about what's happening to population around the world, but of course we mostly take that as a given rather than as something that can be planned or accommodated to. So now I go on to changes needed and the kind of measures that can be taken and how effective are they being to bring about the goals that we want. And I'm going to take here as an example, which is quite a good systematic example, the 6th European Action Programme, for which the European Environment Agency produced last year a good analysis of are we on track. And I'm doing this not so that you grasp every detail of this action program and are we on track for it, but to illustrate to you how you can turn your overall objectives into a more detailed plan for dealing with specific objectives and then try and track progress against them. And this action plan, the 6th Environmental Action Plan, produced by the European Commission, then adopted by all the European countries, set a number of targets for different priority areas. So this first page is about various actions that we're committed to for dealing with climate change. And there's the overall target, the first one, for producing a specific reduction of greenhouse gas emissions in the EU as a whole by the year 2008 to 2012, as agreed internationally. And then there are various things that need to be done to help achieve that. The use of renewable energy resources, doubling the share of combined heat and power, that's a way of producing more efficient production of electricity. Promoting the development and use of alternative fuels in the transport sector, such as the ethanol and biofuels that Frank was talking about, and decoupling economic growth and the demand for transport. And the European Environment Agency drew together the evidence and tried to produce an assessment last year in that outlook column of how well we're getting on, and then in the right-hand side they've illustrated that even more graphically with the smiley pictures or the frowning pictures, which show where we're making progress and where we are not. And I'm afraid you will see that there are rather too many frowning faces indicating that we are not making the progress intended against some of those targets, against most of those targets, in fact, in the climate change area. Here we are on nature and biodiversity. Here there are one or two more smiling faces. Two particular policies in Europe are helping to some extent on nature and biodiversity. We have a good program in Natura for designating conservation areas and trying to have severe regimes within them for protecting natural and biodiversity resources. And we have had a gradual transformation of the common agricultural policy, the policy for supporting farmers throughout Europe, so as to encourage them towards more environmentally responsible farming, more organic farming, less intensive farming and more protection of nature in the farmed areas. And those two are both showing smiling faces, indicating that we are making some progress in those areas. Now here we are on environment and health and quality of life. Here there has been one area of very substantial European action in the last 15-20 years to improve the use and high quality of water, to improve the way that wastewaters are dealt with, and to make some progress on the excess amount of nitrates that wash off the land into waters from excess use of nutrients. And on all of those there is some reasonable progress to make, following a program of quite vigorous regulatory action driven by the European Commission and heavy investment in most European countries to improve the way that water is managed. So that is quite an encouraging success story in the water field within the European area. Here we are on the sustainable use and management of natural resources and waste. This is trying to reduce the amount of waste that we produce and to reuse or recycle more of the waste that has to be produced. In this area we are still not making nearly enough progress, and the future prospects are not very good either. We haven't done as well in this field as we have in water. We haven't put enough investment in, and our various policy measures have all sorts of gaps in them and allow practices to continue in the waste area that are not satisfactory. So this is an illustration of the development of good indicators and their use of them to keep track of progress. And similar things are attempted in many other countries in the world and at many different levels. And that's what you need, some comprehensive goals, systematic analysis, issue by issue, to keep track of what's going on. So now we come to a bit of discussion, and this is my final section, of the key measures that are needed to deal with these issues. And government action I will take first. Government action can be described under four main heads: regulation, fiscal measures, procurement, and education or awareness raising. And sometimes people call these sticks, carrots, levers, and bells. Sticks to compel people to do the right thing. Carrots through fiscal measures, tax arrangements, subsidies that can encourage, incentivize people to do the right thing. Procurement, all the vast amount that governments at all levels spend in the world, and the way they can use that spending power and the things they order for government services, for defence procurement, for all the other things that governments do. They can use their spending power as an enormous lever to drive technological change, and it could be driven much more significantly in the direction of environmental improvement. And bells, making people aware of what they can do, what individuals can do, what families can do, what local authorities can do, what businesses can do. So these are the four areas that governments have to think about. Now, typically, the governments have been best in the regulatory area. That's what governments know how to do. They know how to make laws and rules, what people must do, what they must not do. And that has shown in many countries of the world very good progress in dealing with some of the environmental issues over the last 20, 30 years. Most of the progress that has been made in dealing with pollution and the grosser forms of pollution has been underpinned by strong environmental rules and regulations. People have been required to stop putting out pollutants of various kinds from their factories, putting them out into the atmosphere, putting them into the watercourses. They have been required to make progress on a wide range of issues of that kind. But in many parts of the world, in Europe certainly, and I think in the United States, other parts of the world, there is something of a resistance to continued use of regulation. There's always the danger of backlash, of industry saying, oh, we're not going to be able to compete if we have to have any more measures imposed upon us, our costs are going to go too high. There's a continual debate about regulation. And you can only go so far, or only so far at any one time. It's a difficult matter to use regulation in relation to some of the issues. So then the argument goes, well, can we use fiscal measures more? Can we tax the people who are bad polluters? Can we tax the production of carbon dioxide? Can we tax the production of other emissions, sulfur dioxide or other atmospheric pollutants? Could we tax people who put unpleasant things into the watercourses? Or could we use subsidies to encourage people to do the right things, to produce the cleaner measures than we've had in the past? Well, again, that's much talked about, much discussed. Some interesting examples have been introduced in particular places, but there's a long way still to go. And partly due to, again, the resistance of the public and the resistance of treasury ministries, financial ministries, to allowing their agenda to be driven too much by environmental or sustainable development reasons. So there's a great deal of education and encouragement still to be done there to capture the hearts and minds of finance ministries and of the people around the world to the use of fiscal measures. Then there's procurement, a very largely untapped source still. So many things that governments and other bodies could do to encourage sustainable development. They could, at a very simple level, and they are beginning to do this, insist on all their paper being sourced from recycled paper resources. Governments, of course, are enormous consumers of paper throughout the world, and it's possible for them to be a major driver in the direction of more reuse of paper, thus reducing the pressure on wood pulp and forests throughout the world. Very small example, but that one is coming. But how much more they could do, all the building in the world that is procured by governments, designed for government purposes, and how little of it so far is designed to the highest modern standards of what buildings could be, how much they could reduce the use of energy if they were designed in ways that are better insulated so that they need less heating, and are better ventilated so that they need less cooling, and are more lightly constructed so that they need less resources to be consumed in the very fabric of them. This is a pretty unsustainable building from that point of view, beautiful though it is in many ways. So a great deal to be done in the building field by governments and government authorities of all kinds to advance sustainable development. How much governments could do in the field of vehicles. How many vehicles around the world of all kinds governments are buying, from aeroplanes, tanks, lorries, ordinary cars, and how much they could drive the move towards more efficient types of vehicle. At the moment in the car field, there's a significant move hovering about to be made as the hybrid vehicles become more popular and more available. And they will represent a significant move towards more efficient vehicles which will use less fossil fuel resources. There's just beginning to be the idea that governments could themselves, in their procurement programs for their fleets, move that step towards buying mainly hybrid vehicles, and that will be a significant step forward. But beyond that, we all have heard talk of the hydrogen vehicles, and a great deal of research is going into that. And again, governments could point the way with setting target dates for when they expect to be procuring significant percentages of their whole fleets from hydrogen-fueled vehicles. And again, setting challenge goals of that kind for industry to respond to is a very important part for government action, and we need much more of it. And then education and awareness raising, and how much more needs to be done there. How little people still understand of the threats facing us and of the kind of measures and changes that we need to make as individuals, as families, as groups, as local communities, and at national and international level. And how much more that needs to be built in, not just to the formal education system, not just into the universities, but also into a general raising of consciousness among the public. And our media are helping to some extent, but they are very erratic still in their understanding of the issues and the attention they give it. So an awful lot to be done on all those four fronts, some encouraging signs, but very much further to go yet. So once again, we look at the major issues confronting the world. How far are our combinations of regulation, fiscal measures, knowledge and awareness raising, procurement, likely to enable us to do on these issues that we set out at the beginning? And I think we can say that our combination of measures are doing not too badly on the water issue in many parts of the world now, though much more to be done, and on the pollution issue. Climate change, we have only begun to make a start there. Population growth, governments, for the most part, hesitate to act very decisively in that area at all, apart from a limited amount of assistance for family planning, though that's often inhibited by religious objections in many countries of the world. And we are still far from knowing what exactly we should do on unemployment and unfair distribution of resources. So our battery of tools for sustainable development is better developed in some areas than others and shows better signs of achieving the desired goals. So what are then of other actors? And that's where we need to realize that the problems of sustainable development are not just for governments. They have got to involve business, executive agencies of all kinds, schools and colleges, non-governmental organizations, individuals themselves. Now let's think together, and I expect you will be exploring further in the next 2 or 3 weeks what we can expect from these different areas as well. In the business field, there is still a great battle being fought in the world between the business as usual camp, who consider that business has no higher goal than to maximize profits for shareholders, and that's how they do best for everybody else as well. And for on the other hand, the group who are trying to develop for business a broader concept of corporate social responsibility, realizing that business has other clients than their shareholders. They have the public, they have their consumers, they have their workers, and they have their responsibilities to society as a whole. That movement needs encouragement. It needs to be reconciled, of course, with the profit maximization goal, because corporate social responsibility isn't meant to be a way of saying, let's not make money. It's meant to be a way of saying, let's make money more sustainably. Let's make money in a way that will ensure that our businesses are profitable and successful not only this year, not only next year, but in 5 years, 10 years to come, as the climate of sustainable development compels them through regulation, through tax incentives, through popular pressure, to adjust to the requirements of the future. So corporate social responsibility is businesses trying to face up to the longer-term challenges of sustainable development themselves. And everything that we can do to encourage that development is an important part of the solution to today's problems. Executive agencies of various kinds, they too have their own specific tasks and objectives, but almost every executive agency in all countries of the world can either conceive its goal narrowly, whatever purpose it has been given by statute, or it can conceive it more broadly in the same sort of corporate social responsibility way that I've been commending for business. Schools and colleges are another very good example. Schools and colleges have been wonderful in many ways in developing the understanding, the analysis of the environment and sustainable development, but very frequently they have been terrible as places that manage their own affairs in a sustainable way. Schools and colleges throughout the world have been among the most inefficient buildings energy-wise that there are in the world, and are only gradually getting to grips with their own problems of managing their estates, managing their own consumption of resources in a more sustainable way. And if they can't exemplify what they preach, then they are not doing their job properly. And that's one of the very important challenges in the sustainable development field. All those of us who are preaching what needs to be done in the world need to be good at doing what needs to be done in the world in our own spheres of activity. Non-governmental organizations, of course, have been the conscience of the world in many parts of the world. They've identified the challenges earlier on. They have brought issues vividly to the attention of the public and of governments and of the media. They have campaigned, sometimes successfully, for changes that need to be made. But they too have their responsibilities, ought to have their responsibilities, which they don't always succeed in, to behave in a sustainable way. And then finally, individuals, all of us. And we have to ask ourselves, are we living our own lives? Are we managing our own homes and households in the sustainable way that we are commending for the world? So we need to produce a sustainable development movement that isn't just about what governments should do, but is about how everybody acting together can produce a more sustainable future. In the UK Sustainable Development Strategy, there has been an effort to understand and develop the momentum of that joint action. There has been a recognition that the government alone cannot do everything, and therefore that what they need to be doing is illustrated in this diagram of 4 E's. The role of governments and other organizations is to enable, so that they remove barriers, they encourage people to do right things, to engage, with all sorts of other bodies in society to exemplify, to lead by example, and to encourage through the tax system with grants, reward schemes, and if all those 4 E's can be successfully integrated together, then maybe we get a catalytic change, a step change that can truly move us in a more sustainable direction. That's the idea of the latest version of the UK strategy. And the emphasis in it will be therefore very much on implementation, and implementation in many different places, not just by a sustainable development unit or an environment unit in a department of the environment, but by all government departments, all executive agencies, all to produce their regular reports on how they're getting on specific objectives, and the strengthening of a watchdog, the Sustainable Development Commission, to look at the government's progress on its strategy and to continually act as a gadfly, as a prod, a encourager and a critic when things are falling behind. And a very important part, this strategy needs to be used to inform all parts of public spending and in other aspects of the budget and the tax planning. So the emphasis needs to be throughout. Once you've got the analysis, once you've seen what measures are needed, then how can you strengthen the implementation machinery? So, once again, major issues confronting the world. Have we got here in our various strategies, our measures, the machinery, the possibility of dealing with all the sustainability issues? And I think my provisional answer is that we've got the makings of the system needed in some countries in the world and in Europe, I do believe, but we need to do very much more to engage with the public, to incentivize, to make people aware of what needs doing, so as to create an unstoppable momentum towards sustainability. So that's my presentation. Here are, as I was requested, various sources of information that you may want to refer to during your studies in the weeks ahead. I think some of the United Nations materials are extremely useful background to the problems and the analysis. The World Watch Institute, which Frank has already referred to, has very vivid presentations of some of the particular issues that are most acute at the moment. The European Environment Agency has particularly good analyses for the whole of the wider Europe, and I give you the source at the bottom if anybody wants to follow the particular illustrations that I have given from the UK.